Good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
Thank you for accepting my invitation for Skype interview on Interfaith Dialogue.
Oh, you're welcome.
Would you please introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Scott Alexander. I'm Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Director of Catholic Muslim Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago.
Thank you. Could you briefly define Interfaith Dialogue? What does Interfaith Dialogue mean to you?
I think interfaith dialogue to me means being transformed by an encounter with a person of another faith. I think God calls us all to be more than we are. And the way we become more than we are is by learning about other people, and particularly by learning about other people's relationship with God. And I think no matter what our various faith commitments might be, when we learn about the depth and beauty and richness of somebody else's relationship with God, it can serve to strengthen our own.
Great. So, what's the target? Who is the target audience for Interfaith Dialogue in United States?
I think interfaith dialogue ought to be a part of every citizen's life. I mean, the United States is a profoundly plural society. We are made up of people of so many different ethnic and racial and religious backgrounds, and so in order to be a cohesive society, in order to sort of function together and pursue common goals for the common good of us all, we need to understand one another as deeply as possible. And I think interreligious understanding is a critical component of this. So I would just say that interfaith dialogue is a critical component of a healthy civic life.
What are the challenges of interfaith dialogue in United States, especially maybe for these days?
Well, there are many. I mean, I think they're the challenges that face us on so many other levels. So we seem to be at a point where we're almost shouting at each other rather than trying to understand one another. And so I think that interfaith dialogue gives us the opportunity to listen to one another so that we can sort of understand where the other person is coming from. It's a skill that can be transferred outside of the interfaith arena to so many other arenas. I think what we have as a special gift in interfaith dialogue is the sense that we're all doing this before a higher power. We're all doing this in the sight of God, and so that we're all bound to a certain kind of humility. I also think that one of the special features of interfaith dialogue that helps us understand why dialogue is so important is our mutual conviction, or what ought to be our mutual conviction, that in every human being is an inviolable dignity that has been given to them by God. And so that when we face any other human being, we're actually facing someone who is a beloved creature of God, and that we have to honor that status in everybody we encounter. And I don't think that understanding of human dignity is necessarily at the foundation of other types of dialogue in our society. And I think that's why some of those types of dialogue fail.
Hmm. Do you think it's a necessity in today's world?
Uh, Definitely. For the reasons I've already alluded to, I don't see how in a society uh, where people are challenged to get along with each other, and to find the common ground on which we can move forward together, how we can not be equipped to understand our religious differences as a part of that challenge.
Hmm. Should we have any concern about losing our own religious beliefs and identity or cultural identity when we are having dialogue with other faith traditions?
That's a great question. You know, I've been in interfaith dialogue for a long time, and I've actually never experienced either myself or sort of heard about with other people involved in interfaith dialogue. They're losing their faith because of interfaith dialogue. I think if someone is searching and they're not sure of what they believe, I'm not sure interfaith dialogue is a threat. Actually, interfaith dialogue for someone who's searching and not sure of what he or she believes, interfaith dialogue might be one way in which they can become clearer about what it is they believe. Now, in some cases, that might mean that someone from one tradition decides to sort of adopt another tradition. But I think that's very rare. And I think that most people who engage in interfaith dialogue are doing it because they feel deeply rooted in their own faith tradition. And that deep rootedness in their own faith tradition is motivating them to try to understand people of other faith traditions. And if that is the case, and I think that's the case with most people that engage in interreligious dialogue, what actually ends up happening is that you become stronger in your own faith commitment, not because you realize how wrong everybody else is, but because that in a very mysterious way, that encounter with people of other faiths actually invites you to explore some of the deeper dimensions of your own faith. And that process of that exploration just, I think, draws you closer to God and binds you more closely with your own community.
Great, thank you. Should we be judgmental to others' faiths when we see something kind of so-called absurd in their religion, or criticize them or discuss about those, or just ignore it?
Well, I don't think if we see something in someone else's faith tradition, we think we see something in someone else's faith tradition that disturbs us or that we're confused about, I don't think we should ignore it, because you can't have genuine dialogue by ignoring it. But I think we have to adopt a posture of humility, and instead of rushing judgment about something that we probably don't completely understand. And that's usually the case when something disturbs us, bothers us. A lot of times we're not completely understanding what that is. So I think we have to adopt a posture of humility and seek deeper understanding. Ultimately, we have to make our own judgments about things, right? And understandings of truth, and understandings of God, and understandings of moral values, all these kinds of things. I don't think the dialogue itself is the venue for making those judgments. The dialogue is the venue for gaining the understanding. And that's almost a never-ending process. But along the way, we may have to make our own judgments about what we think we're understanding and what we're hearing. But I don't think it's very helpful to bring those judgments into the dialogue, because if we start judging one another in the dialogue, that's going to interfere with the process of trying to understand one another.
Do you think we can find some Islamic references for interfaith dialogue from the life of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and from Quran and from the sayings of Prophet?
Absolutely. In fact, as a Christian who's been studying Islam for a while, so many of my inspirations for dialogue actually come from the Quran and the Sunnah. Wow. So, for instance, this famous verse in Surah Al-Hujurat, يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا, and then going on, إن أكرمكم عند
الله أتقاكم.
Right. So a lot of times, so the verse translates, "O humanity, we have created you from one male and one female, and we have appointed you to tribes and nations so that you may come to know one another." And that's beautiful in and of itself. And many people stop there, full stop, right? But what comes after is, verily the most noble among you in the sight of God is the most God conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there actually, in that verse, there is a very profound connection that the Quran is making between ta'aruf,
Mm-hmm.
coming to know one another, and taqwa.
Mm-hmm.
Because I actually believe, and it's been my personal experience, that the more I come to understand people, particularly of other faiths, the more I come to appreciate, for instance, as a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
Muslims' experience of God, Muslims' understanding of God, the higher my God consciousness, inshallah,
Mm-hmm.
becomes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a great mystery that's being taught us by that important ayah in the Quran. And of course, the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is just filled with. I mean, he was a man of dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
His entire life was one of opening himself up and opening his own heart up to people, particularly sharing the revelations, of course, that he received from God with people, but listening very carefully to
Mm-hmm.
what other people are saying, and trying to understand them so that he could bring people together, in submission to God for the welfare of the human family.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, when we have this verse in the Quran, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَى رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, I have experienced, as someone who's trying to commit my life to interreligious dialogue, that one of the ways in which the Prophet has been a mercy to me,
Mm-hmm.
is the way in which he has embodied this dialogic way of life.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. What kind of programs, events, and activities would you suggest to the practitioners on the ground to facilitate and promote interfaith dialogue?
Wow, that's a great question. It all depends on the context.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever people ask me, what would you advise as concrete steps to take, et cetera, et cetera, I oftentimes say, you know better than I do.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're talking about college campuses, there are some things that work in those settings, right?
Mm-hmm.
That don't necessarily work in other settings. If we're talking about relationships between a particular congregation, for instance, an Islamic center and a church or a synagogue, the kinds of activities you can have, the kinds of things you can do, might be very different than those that you can do on a college campus. Some of the things that I will say that might be kind of common elements that are worth focusing on is first of all the whole challenge to sort of understand what the principles of dialogue are in the first place. So a lot of people don't, they hear the word dialogue, they think they know what it means,
Mm-hmm.
but it really is worth taking the time to flesh out, for instance, the difference between dialogue and debate.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't necessarily understand. Dialogue is for the purposes of mutual understanding. It's
Mm-hmm.
not for the purposes of figuring out who's right and who's wrong.
And convincing others, maybe.
Right, or convincing others, or trying to convert others to your particular, faith
Religion.
tradition. So, there are a number of different, principles like that are very important, and they transfer, kind of across the spectrum. The other thing that I think is important is looking at the relationship between the conversations that we have, the encounters that we have, and the kinds of activities that we might devise to facilitate those encounters, and then things we can do together to solve or to address common challenges. So I think in the Catholic tradition we talk about four types of dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about dialogue of theological exchange, which is basically when we're talking about our beliefs, our practices, maybe like interpreting our scriptures together with one another, trying to figure out how we understand the various revelatory traditions that we are heirs to. All right, so that's dialogue of theological exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's dialogue of spiritual experience. And that's a little different because sometimes theological exchange dialogues require a certain degree of expertise in your own tradition. And a lot of people might not necessarily have a lot of expertise in terms of the history of doctrine, or in terms of, if we're going to talk about fiqh, for instance, they may not have a lot of expertise. But one thing that almost every person of faith is expert in is his or her own experience of being a Muslim, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Jew, what that means, prayer, fasting, charity, that we all engage in those activities, we can share with other people what those activities mean to us, right? So that's the dialogue of spiritual experience. And then there's the dialogue of social action, right? Figuring out how, based on our common values and ideals, how we can work together to face common challenges. And then, something called the dialogue of life, which is the fourth type, which is just profoundly sharing our lives together, which doesn't necessarily require any theological conversation whatsoever. I mean, when Jews and Muslims are becoming friends with each other and they're going to each other's house and sharing meals with each other, they don't necessarily have to talk about the Quran or the Bible or anything like that. They can just be sharing each other's life. So those four kinds of dialogue, you show the multidimensionality of it. But so I would say that almost any type of dialogue activity should probably look at each of those four dimensions and ask what are the ways in which that particular activity can speak to all four of those dimensions of dialogue.
Great, thank you. I am done with my questions. If you would like to add anything else, please welcome as an advice to our beginners of Interfaith Dialogue.
Well, here's what I'd like to say. I'd just like to say a word about the Hizmet movement and Fethullah Gulen. In all my years of doing interfaith dialogue, he has been one of the great inspirations to me. And the movement itself and the movement's commitment to witnessing to authentic Islam, but doing so in profound humility, inviting other people into dialogue of mutual understanding for the purposes of serving one another and giving glory to God in that service, by bringing people together, by trying to address common social challenges, by trying to build social cohesion. I mean, this has been part of the teaching of Fethullah Gulen for decades and decades, and you can see its fruit in so many of the great dialogue institutions that the Hizmet movement has been able to found and nurture, not just here in the United States, but all around the world. So I'm just very grateful that I've been able to learn from the Hizmet movement about dialogue and from Fethullah Gulen about dialogue, and I just want to encourage all those people who are also inspired by the commitments of the Hizmet movement and by the teachings of Fethullah Gulen. I just want to encourage you to keep going and keep asking yourself how you might feel called to engage in this dialogue, to lead this dialogue, and to help advance the cause of mutual understanding and solidarity of the human family.
Thank you so much for these very informative and inspiring comments. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alevi.